So, quick question. How many of y'all heard of Gatsby before? How many of y'all have used it before? Brenda, yes. Cool. So I'm going to be talking about that today. But before I do that, my name is Adekunle. Usually, I like to show it because people have a hard time pronouncing it, but when they see it, it kind of makes sense. So I'm actually born and raised in New York. My parents are from Nigeria, so welcome to New York if some of y'all are not from here. Like I said, we're currently working at MailChimp right now. I just got off orientation yesterday, so I don't know much about it. So if you have any questions or concerns, don't bother me with it yet. So before I talk about Gatsby and how it's so powerful and why it's so useful, I'm first going to talk about the basics of prototyping. So, quick question: can anyone have a definition about what is a prototype? Yes. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. Blueprint? Okay. One more. No? Okay. So I kind of define it literally as a sample application used to test and validate a product. And I kind of highlight test and validate because I think that's the whole idea about prototyping. It's not how it looks, but how it functions. But why do we actually create prototypes? For me, there's 4 specific reasons why. So the first idea is that it actually is a way to kind of communicate ideas. And when I say communicate, it's often more along the lines of selling ideas, because often you have to sell your ideas not only to your colleagues, but to stakeholders and whatnot. It's also important to kind of uncover edge cases. The most important thing is that the longer you wait to uncover edge cases, the more expensive it gets. So ideally, you want to do that early in the design process rather than waiting until engineers start building and whatnot. Next, test usability early. I kind of do it in the process where usually I kind of test my solutions as soon as within a week, because it's better to kind of get it out early and kind of see when it fails rather than waiting until the end, especially when it gets to a point where you see these edge cases and they start popping up and whatnot. And finally, display states. A lot of the products I worked in the past have been very data heavy. So in order to kind of package it up in one deliverable to the engineers, I usually put it in the prototype so it can kind of show all these different states and whatnot. So now that we've got the what and the why, let's talk about the different types of it. So I'm going to kind of touch on the types within digital product design. And there's kind of 3 different types, but I think there are more, but this is the kind of 3 that I usually do. The first is paper prototype. This is actually one I did when I was at NASDAQ with one of my colleagues. And it's the basic form of prototyping, usually pen, paper, tape. And this is actually great when you're working with stakeholders, because most people are very intimidated about the design process. So this is a good way to kind of include them into the design process with little and no friction. Another way of doing it is doing a clickable prototype. So this one is done in PowerPoint, which I've never thought this was possible. But my colleague actually created a prototype in PowerPoint because we were dealing with a lot of stakeholders that weren't familiar with InVision and whatnot. So rather than kind of forcing them to kind of learn a tool, we kind of gave them a prototype that was kind of speaking their language, basically. And last, we got another clickable prototype, which is InVision. I think most people are kind of familiar with it. This allows you to kind of create more richer animations and be able to kind of simulate the experience to a certain extent. But these prototype methods have a common pain point that I kind of want to describe to you. So the first one is the creation of too many artifacts. We've all been there where we're working on a UI and we say all right, this is going to be the final version. And then what ends up happening is okay, I made another change, another final, it was like, all right, let me do another change. Oh, it's kind of cut off, but how many of y'all done this before? And those that are not raising hand, you're lying. And this is more for like the individual, because I've done this before, but when you start having like an actual design team, what often happens is that the more individuals that's part of the team, the more artifacts you get. And you get to a point where it's like not managed, it's unmaintainable, because usually you can't really find the final prototype and whatnot. So it's kind of confusing, especially for people that are starting to get onboarded. The next is that it doesn't really simulate the real experience. Oftentimes what it is like you're kind of creating how it looks, but you're not really kind of creating how the product is actually going to act. It's basically a painting to some sort. And then in some cases when you're trying to like design around it and kind of test the experience, it's kind of underwhelming. And I think what it is that usually what we do is like we try to see that we're trying to creating the actual visual aspect of it, but we should start looking at creating the actual functionality first. Next, collaboration is hard, especially if you're working with more than 2 or 3 designers or developers. There's no real way to kind of create a good collaborative environment around mockups. There's these tools called Figma, which makes it quite easier, but in some cases, what often happens is like it's kind of like a awkward handshake when you're kind of trying to collaborate, especially when I did this with another designer where we kind of had like our own sketch files and then we tried to like merge them together and it wasn't really working. But here comes the front-end prototype, which is kind of going to save the day for you. So front-end prototype is basically a description of it is that it's just a prototype that's built in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But why? Why should we create front-end prototypes? So the first thing is that it creates an idea where you have one master deliverable. So you don't have to have all these scattered artifacts all around. You can kind of merge them all together. An approach I've done in the past is where we have multiple design teams working on a product. And what we basically do is that we kind of branch off of master. And then when we're done and when we kind of do user tests and whatnot, we merge it back into master. So this is basically a similar approach that most like engineers are working with. And I think it's a good way for designers to work because it makes it more collaborative and having a place where you have one deliverable. The next thing is the idea of using real data and content. Most of the time when people are using our product, they're not really using it just for the design itself. They're using it for the actual information that it's providing and the actual solution that it's kind of solving. The next thing is that you can actually design the real experience. You not only can design how it looks, but you can kind of see like when the data is not loading, how can you kind of design around that? And I think the idea is that you want to have a design approach that's more proactive than reactive. And the last one is that you're going to be in a place where it's more of a handshake approach rather than a handoff. So rather than basically coming up with design and handing off to the engineer, you could do an approach where you kind of work in parallel. So the engineer can kind of do their own thing, the designer can kind of do their own thing, but then usually what you're kind of doing is like you're collaborating, working towards a goal rather than you just handing it off and basically the engineer is going to go finish it off. But let's talk about Gatsby. One of the good things about Gatsby is that it is built on React. How many of y'all have used React or heard of it? Quite a few. It's probably the most popular framework out here, especially JavaScript framework, and it's pretty stable. And the good thing about it is that if you know how to use React, you're kind of halfway there about be able to like use Gatsby itself. So this is kind of an example I wanted to show before, but this was when I was at NASDAQ when I was working with a group of designers, 5 designers, and we were working on a very data-heavy application. So rather than kind of working either in Photoshop or Sketch or whatnot, the idea was that we're going to basically have one prototype where we all work off of, and we're just basically going to iterate over time. So as you see here, a lot of it was just basically a lot of data visualization and data and whatnot. And the good thing about it is that we were able to kind of divide and conquer this application itself. So we had one person that was focusing on the data viz. We had someone else was working on that was focusing on like the KPIs and like the visualization and whatnot. And the thing was that but the thing is that it made it very collaborative and whatnot. So I think my slides kind of but why Gatsby? I already kind of explained that already. Static site generators are hot right now. If some of y'all probably use like Jekyll, Middleman, Next, and whatnot, the great thing about it is that they're kind of a good place to kind of build applications without having an actual backend. So this is this idea called serverless. It's not really serverless, but it's kind of saying that you don't really need a database. And usually the term is called like Jamstack. So it's like JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And the whole idea is that you're leveraging these APIs within your static websites. And what's happening is that all you're doing is just kind of like fetching data and basically putting it into your application. And you're kind of, the user's actually interacting with the API rather than the actual site itself. Sorry, I think I got my slides a little mixed up. So another reason why you should probably use Gatsby is the idea of called GraphQL. Has anyone heard of GraphQL? We got a couple of people. So basically, it's a query language. It's a way to kind of for you to interact with the API. I know that doesn't really make sense. I still don't really get it too. But I'm gonna show a demo about like how to kind of be able to kind of make a lot of requests to an API and get the data you want. All right. So let's get into like how can you start using Gatsby right now for prototyping. There's 3 steps. I think it's like the simplest way to do it, but you could definitely do it in a way where you can make it more dynamic. But I'm kind of going over like the easiest way to kind of do it. So the first thing you want to do is like establish a design system, especially when you're doing prototypes. The idea is that you're not really focusing on the look of it, but actually like figuring out like the idea and basically testing that idea out. So if you kind of split it up into like 2 major buckets within the design system, you can do it in a way where you have this idea of called functional CSS, which I'm going to go over later on, and the idea of components. So what is functional CSS? Does anyone know what functional CSS is?
Is it the thing where like you like have classes that represent styles and just apply them to your markup?
Yeah, correct. This is the term I've kind of found on the internet, but it's basically the idea where you have these classes that kind of do a single thing. So if some of y'all kind of understand what functional programming is, it's kind of the same thing, but just with CSS. And here's like kind of like an example of it. So in this case, this is more on lines of having these like functional classes that's controlling font size. So as you can see, we have F1, F2, F3, F4, F5. But let's kind of use this as an example. So let's say we have something where we have this. So I have this H1 tag, and I kind of want to give it some sort of styling. There's many ways to kind of do this, but kind of like the approach that most of us are kind of used to is like to add a class and then to write some CSS to actually give that style. But with functional CSS, you don't necessarily need to do that. All you have to do is add a combination of classes, and then basically you're kind of building the UI out. Some people don't like this approach, and I think you should kind of use it wisely, but the whole idea is that you want to be in a place where you don't have to keep on writing or reinventing the wheel around design. If you have established these patterns already, you can kind of leverage them easily with functional CSS. The next thing that we talked about was components. Since Gatsby.js is built on React, a lot of the stuff we're going to be building is like React components. And these are pretty simple where, let's say we have this thing called a badge, and we have different types. So as you see in the top, we have the example. And if you can see in the bottom, we have like these 4 elements. So we have a badge, and then they have different types. So we give them different props based on the styling. And the thing about this is that especially if you're an engineer, you don't really have to focus on like, all right, I have to like design this actual badge. And they have to write CSS, because most engineers hate writing CSS. But that's another talk. All right, so the next thing you want to do is kind of set up Gatsby. Gatsby has actually one of the best documentations I've seen. So you should definitely check it out, and if you want to learn more about it. But here are kind of like the simple things you kind of could do for setting up. So the first thing you want to do is you want to install Gatsby CLI. Once that is done, you could definitely, all you have to do is do Gatsby new. And then I use Generate demo, but you could use that for whatever. Like this is just going to be the directory name. And then the last line is basically saying, I'm going to go into the directory and then run Gatsby develop. And if everything goes well, basically you just get like basically the starter kit of it. And once that's done, you kind of have it in a place where you can kind of get started prototyping. So I'm going to kind of walk through an example that I think it's going to make it easy for people to kind of understand. I know the Avengers Endgame's coming out today, right? Or tomorrow? Tomorrow. OK. So I'm going to kind of use that example as like a project where we want to create a grid of like all the Avengers characters or posters like that. So let's say we have our data. I'm just going to use static data because you could do it from an API, but for this example, we just use something that's static. So we have like an array of all these objects, which are containing the information for our project. And then what we could do is basically, when you start up GraphQL, it gives you this ability to kind of basically pick and choose the information you want. So in this case, I'm just getting 4 specific information from the actual data, or it could be a database. And on the right-hand side, it's basically showing you how the payload is going to look like. And this is good, especially if you have multiple streams of information coming in. You can kind of pick and choose which information you get, which is great. And then let's say we get into the actual markup. So this is kind of like straightforward, especially with the people that know React. But what's happening is that I am importing React. There's like a layout component. And then within there, I'm having a place where I'm kind of defining the index page and then exporting it. So nothing is really happening over here yet. So what kind of changed is that if you look at the bottom, where you see the export const query, I'm basically using the information I kind of created when I was in that kind of GraphQL playground, and I'm just put it in there. And what you're doing here is you're just basically defining what information you want to get for this specific component or this specific page. Once you get in there, what's happening is that I'm basically writing some markup where I have this data, I'm just mapping through it, and I'm providing styles to it. So I get something like this, which is like just kind of getting the information in there. But let's kind of like add some style to it. And you can kind of do this with just functional CSS, where you combine different CSS class names, and you get something like this. And then let's say it's like, well, this is kind of boring. Let's kind of add images instead of the text, and maybe have some sort of interaction when the user clicks on something, they can kind of see the bio itself. So you get something like this. So for this, it took me like around 10 minutes to kind of create this. And this is kind of like the super basic level. But if you want to kind of take it to another approach where you want to say it's going to kind of get information from another API and whatnot, you still could do that too. But there's a problem, because currently right now, this is actually on my local machine, but I want to share it out to my other colleagues or maybe a stakeholder and whatnot. This is where the combination of using Gatsby with GitHub and Netlify to kind of making sure that you can kind of deploy your actual websites. So Netlify is basically a way that you can kind of deploy websites from GitHub. So the first thing you do is that you'll have this kind of repo already. So I have this like test repo. And then what you're going to do is that you're going to log into Netlify. And then once you kind of log into it, you get a screen like this. And then what's going to happen is that when you click on that green button, say new site from Git, you're going to get something like this. And the great thing about it is that you don't have to use GitHub. You can use Bitbucket, GitLab, and whatnot. So depending on like which one you prefer. And then you get this screen. So when you get to the screen, you have to specify which branch you want, which repo that you want to Netlify to actually look at. So we're going to say we're going to use Gatsby prototype as the repo. And over here, you can specify the branch, what commands you want to kind of use to build out, and then the actual directory itself. And then when you click on deploy site, you get something like this. So when you get to this page, what's happened is that it's building in the background, so you don't have to really do much. It takes around like 5 to 10 minutes for it to actually build out. But once that's done, what happens is that it will give you this URL, if you see on the top hand side. And then if you click on that, your page is somewhere, it's being hosted right now. So if you want to kind of share with other people, you can. But the great thing about this is that it's a continuous deployment. So if I make some changes and I was like, all right, I made some changes and I want someone to kind of review it, within 5 or 10 minutes, the changes will be updated. So literally, it's the actual deployment process is fairly simple and easy. But there's not one way of doing things. This is a great article about Code Sandbox, which is kind of similar to like CodePen and whatnot. They kind of announced this idea of Code Sandbox containers. So literally, you can kind of spin up a Gatsby website within the browser itself. So as you can see, there's like the options. If you click on Gatsby, what happens is that you get something like this. So this also gives you another way to kind of collaborate with engineers, but also with designers, because I think the idea of where designers and engineers working together in parallel is super important. So this is like another option. This is another idea of using Gatsby themes. And the whole idea is that it just bootstraps an actual Gatsby site for you, because the actual setup process for it is actually quite heavy sometimes. So if you're in a place where you're constantly prototyping the same UI, whatever like that, you can spit up actual Gatsby theme and then use it kind of like a library, essentially. The first thing is that the idea should drive the method. So I wouldn't say go out and just start prototyping in Gatsby right now, because that's probably like the worst idea ever. But I kind of would say that depending on the process and the people you work with, if you're at a point where you need to kind of validate something that's more aligned to the real experience, but not do it in a way where you have to wait until engineering is done, you might want to use some sort of front-end prototype. But if you're still in the case where you not really sure about the idea and whatnot, you should probably not do it, because you'll spend more time on the technical restraints and all that stuff. Another thing is that you want to keep the prototype simple. I've been in a place where we made our front-end prototype as difficult as the actual production, which is not good, because what ends up happening is that You spend more time, again, with like the technical restraints and solving bugs and whatnot, rather than actually building and building solutions. And last, I want to talk about the idea of the relationship between front-end prototypes and production. So if you have a good design system that allows you to kind of not only leverage the system for your production, but also front-end prototypes, it allows you to kind of have multiple uses for the design system, but also you don't have to replicate the work itself, which is good too. That's about it. Thanks for listening.